Welcome to Working for Women, the Independent Women's Forum podcast, where we are changing the conversation about women and public policy for the better.
Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Gunlock with the Independent Women's Forum, and this is another edition of the Working for Women podcast. Today, I'm talking to Julie Kelly, a good friend. We've talked before on this podcast. She's an agricultural writer, food writer. She's a chef. She lives in Orland Park, Illinois. And again, she's been on these podcasts before. We follow her at IWF, and I encourage everybody listening to find Julie on Twitter and to find the different outlets that she writes for, because she is quite a voice out there talking about food freedom and the freedom of farmers to use the products that they want to use. So she's a really, I think, important voice on those issues. We are going to pivot, though, a little bit away from the issues that Julie usually covers and talk about this recent election. And one of the primary players in the election was a woman named Kellyanne Conway, who ran the Trump campaign. I'm sure everybody is aware that Kellyanne Conway has not been getting such positive press, certainly not the positive press one would expect when she is the first female to run a winning presidential campaign. So Julie Kelly wrote about the hypocrisy that we're seeing, the double standards that we're seeing in the press. So she joins me today to talk about that. Hey, Julie.
Hey, Julie. How are you?
Thanks for coming on. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about your article? It was in the Federalist, and it was published, I think, a couple weeks ago. Why don't you tell them what you wrote about and how you feel about this issue?
Sure. I wrote about Kellyanne Conway, her amazing success in turning around the Trump campaign, a little bit about her story. She's an attorney. She's a pollster. She started her own business. She's also a mother of four. And how she has really not received the media attention nor the adoration from women, particularly modern-day feminists, for her accomplishments and achievements, which have been on her own accord, not because of her husband's last name, like our defeated candidate, Democratic candidate for president. And it really touched a nerve. It really spread like wildfire. I think it resonated with a lot of women, particularly on our side. And I did several interviews about it. And it was also interesting, the response I got from liberal feminists and their reaction to it. We can talk about that in a moment. But I really do think that Kellyanne has not received a lot of the credit that she's deserved. And now we're starting to see, after my article and some other people have talked about this, we're starting to see some blowback in the liberal media. Dana Milbank, who's a columnist with Washington Post, wrote an egregious piece you probably saw a few days ago, so this would have been December 7th or 8th, saying how Kellyanne Conway's misplaying the woman card. I mean, if that isn't the most condescending, elitist accusation you can make, but that's how hard the media is spinning against her, which only, of course, underscores my premise.
I want to expand a little bit on what Dana Milbank wrote. So again, what Julie's trying to say here, and I think her article is really worth a read, because she points out that if this had been a female who had run a Democrat campaign, we would have nothing but adoration and compliments and all sorts of praise for this woman, but it has been a media blackout and a feminist blackout for Kellyanne Conway. But Dana Milbank, you had mentioned Kelly, wrote a piece. There's been several events that Kellyanne Conway has participated in. She was up at Harvard participating in a roundtable discussion that got very heated. They accused her of running a racist campaign, the Hillary campaign, accused her of running a racist campaign, absolutely obnoxious comments coming from the Hillary campaign. And then she was recently at another event where she talked about how working in the White House is very difficult for working mothers because, and look, I worked on the Hill. I worked on Capitol Hill for many years, and I quit when I had kids because it's just a very difficult lifestyle. You work incredibly long hours. And so can you explore a little bit, because then Dana Milbank wrote an article that was totally false. I mean, Jake Tapper actually wrote on Twitter that is not an appropriate representation of what Kellyanne Conway said. So can you explore that a little bit more for our listeners?
Sure. And actually the original piece, because people started tweeting it to me, was in Slate. And what they suggested was that Kellyanne Conway said that women should not work, working mothers should not work in the White House, which of course was just a blatant lie. And you read her comments, and what she was saying is, as a mother of 4, her children are all under the age of 12, I think was the age, that 24/7, constantly on, demanding, traveling, etc., was not something that she wanted to do. And I think what she was saying was, when she had to explain to men who were pushing her to take a job at the White House, and she would say back to them, would you want your wife to take this job? And she said that just completely changed their attitude. That's the realities of life. I mean, despite, and I think this is great, despite your huge level of fame, your huge earning potential, when you have obligated yourself to be a mother, especially of 4 children, that really overrides, a lot of decisions that we make when they're that young.
Well, but also, what's so sad about this is that this is just a wonderful opportunity to demonstrate how far women have come. What Kellyanne Conway is living proof of is that women have choices today. Mm-hmm. I did a panel just on Monday it was Repeal Day. It was the anniversary of the repeal of prohibition, and I was on a panel, and I was actually very sympathetic to early feminists and early women of the women's movement who were pro-prohibition. And I was trying to say, look, let's not be sort of let's remember that we shouldn't look at historical things with a modern lens. And I ticked off all the ways in which women were disadvantaged around in the early 20th century. I mean, not able to own property, not able to have any legal claim to their earnings, not able to vote. And so I, was saying that, life was really awful, and there was a tremendous amount more alcohol consumption and wife abuse. And so many women backed prohibition because they thought it would improve their lives. Women just didn't have choices. And when you think about what Kellyanne's life is, that she can make this choice for herself, what's best for her. And also, let's not forget, she has children, she is a mother, their happiness counts too. And yet she's being dismissed as somehow endorsing not working, mothers not working in the White House. That's precisely the opposite of what she was saying. She was saying you can choose to do that, but it is your choice, and there are trade-offs. You won't see your kids as much, and it will be difficult. And so it's just terrible how the media spins this stuff when, again, this should be a good news story.
Well, and aside from the fact, look, she said, I'm not going to work for the White House. I'm not going to work for a man and be at his beck and call. I'm going to keep my own business. I'm going to make a lot more money. I'm going to have a lot more flexibility and freedom. I guess the feminist movement thinks if you don't have some full-time job somewhere with a male boss and you're carving your own path, that's a bad thing. But here's the other point that I made when people started tweeting that to me, which was, I think Slate had to walk that back, is I don't recall people criticizing Michelle Obama, who's an Ivy League educated, very intelligent woman, giving up her legal career here in Chicago to be the first lady and grow an organic garden. That is not, there was no criticism of her. She is still hailed as a feminist hero, and I think that she is. And she's raised 2 beautiful daughters. I think she has conducted herself very well as first lady. She's been a lady. She's been a strong voice for military families. No one has criticized her. And the fact that now they turn around, but here they don't recognize their own hypocrisy. It's either hypocrisy or willful ignorance or both. And here's the most egregious thing that I got back. They did not support Kellyanne Conway. Now get this. Because she supported a man who treated women the way that he did and was accused of sexual assault and said things about women. Now think about that. All I had to do was tweet back or say back, and your candidate, what did she do? Much worse in supporting a man who has been accused of horrible things towards women, and you supported her without question.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is so typical and so frustrating. I think the other thing about Kellyanne Conway is people forget that she was not like an intern for the Trump campaign who then rose through the ranks, Kellyanne Conway is a really sort of important woman in Washington. She has a very established career as a well-known pollster. Actually, the Independent Women's Forum has done polling with Kellyanne Conway. I did a joint opinion piece with Kellyanne Conway based on some polling that her company did for us. She is a well-known pollster in Washington, D.C. She is a sort of a famous female leader within the conservative movement and liberty movement. And so, like, this idea that, like, she only has one choice, that is to go and work for Donald Trump, it's just so absurd. I mean, Kellyanne Conway is at least in Washington circles, I would say, inside the Beltway, she's quite famous. And now she has international and national fame. But the idea that she needs this position is kind of absurd. And again, I think this is the kind of thing, the kind of message that gets carried by the media. That reasonable people, when you sit down and look, Julie, you and I have people friends that are very left of center, and I have a feeling that if we sat down with them and had a reasonable conversation about this, there would be no disagreement.
I don't, unfortunately, after dealing with them, and I know a few of the friends that we're speaking about, I don't think that they lack the emotional intelligence. I don't think that, quite frankly, they have the integrity to come to terms with where we might find areas of agreement. They actually have gotten so off the rails, or so egregiously out of their minds nuts that Donald Trump won for president, that they're not even rational human beings. In fact, I've cut quite a few of them off, and I know you have too. I don't have time for that. And if you want to spin yourself into the ground and make up all kinds of imaginary, scary scenarios, and that Kellyanne Conway is somehow, leading the charge to take our country into darkness because you're sorry your candidate lost. I can't help you.
Right.
You're beyond help.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. It really is a bizarre time we live in. I mean, absolutely. I wrote a piece right after the election, really encouraging parents to calm down and not scare their children. It's amazing that even had to be said. We live in hyper-political times. We live in times of, everyone talks about fake news, but apparently the only fake news is that, offered by conservative sites. And so I think it is frustrating, and perhaps I was too generous there, because I do think that people have lost some ability to reason. Although I will say, maybe outside of the women that we work with that are more left of center, I think that I have some personal friends who are left of center who are more reasonable and have sort of calmed down, and hopefully the nation as a whole will. I really do hope Kellyanne Conway is recognized for her accomplishments, her really significant accomplishments, and I really hope the press stops spinning her decisions as anti-feminist. It's disgusting, and it's wrong, and it's just reprehensible.
Here's another great thing about Kellyanne Conway: she doesn't care. She doesn't care if she gets the approval by the media liberal. She doesn't care if the feminists like her. And that's the other thing that upsets them even more. They're threatened by strong, independent-minded, conservative women like us, like Kellyanne, because we don't care. We're not playing your game. And they're afraid that we are going to take the game, make it our own, and they're going to be even further marginalized, which is exactly where they belong.
Well, I think you're right. And the last thing I'll say is that I think it's interesting watching their response to Donald Trump tweeting. He doesn't need the press. He doesn't need them. He's got a direct line to the American people. I find many of his tweets to be totally amusing. And you can tell, when Kellyanne is asked about will Donald Trump continue to tweet? I mean, who cares, right? Like, we've got bigger issues than this. But the press is so spun up about this because they're not controlling the message.
Exactly. And I will say, too, if you want a stark comparison between Kellyanne and what the media is doing in the Clinton campaign, take a look at Jennifer Palmieri's op-ed in the Washington Post yesterday. That would have been December 8th. It's outrageous. They're continuing to stoke fear in people. They want people to be upset and afraid. And she's representative not just of the modern-day feminists, the left, but, the media as well.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
It's really an outrageous stark contrast between the two sides right now.
Well,
but
look,
hey, we
Julie,
won, so they can just
yeah, exactly. Get over it. But I will tell our listeners this. Look, in addition to reading Palmieri's piece and rolling your eyes, do take a moment to read Julie Kelly's piece in the Federalist. Julie, when did it run?
It was posted December 1st on the
December
Federalist.
1st. It's a really good piece, and Julie got a lot of activity on Twitter because of it. So I encourage you to do that. Julie, tell everyone where they can find you on Twitter and some of the other outlets you write for.
Sure. I'm a National Review Online contributor. I have most of my articles on there, but I'm also on Twitter, Julie_Kelly2, and I'm usually pretty available during the day, and I love to hear from people, and I like to debate them, as you know, Julie. It's my specialty.
Julie is very brave on Twitter. I am not quite as brave or as active on Twitter, but Julie is quite the firecracker on Twitter. So listen, Julie, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure. I always enjoy talking to you.
Well, same. Thanks so much for having me on all the time. I love it.
Okay, great. Well, we'll have you on again soon. So for everyone listening, thank you so much. This has been another edition of the Working for Women podcast.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please give it a thumbs up, share it on social media, or stop by iwf.org for similar content.